A quiet walk through the snowy woods of northern Idaho was supposed to be nothing more than another afternoon alone for former Navy SEAL Grant Keller. Then a faded red board appeared near an old fence, and beside it lay an exhausted German shepherd, barely strong enough to stand. When Grant stepped closer, the dog forced herself between him and a small opening behind the board, refusing to abandon whatever she was protecting. Hidden beneath old blankets and straw were 3 tiny German shepherd puppies, pressed together against the freezing wind. But tucked inside their makeshift shelter was something that changed the meaning of everything Grant was seeing. An old wool cap with the name Walter Finch stitched inside. Walter was a 74-year-old carpenter Grant knew from town, and if his dog and his hat were here in the snow, one question suddenly mattered more than anything else. Where was Walter? Tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches you, please like, comment, and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. Winter had a way of making northern Idaho look cleaner than it really was. Snow covered the ditches, softened the roofs of old sheds, erased tire scars from the county road, and turned every tired fence post into something almost graceful. By late afternoon, the land beyond the edge of town had become a wide white silence, broken only by dark pines and the thin gray line of the road. Grant Keller preferred it that way. At 52, Grant had learned that silence rarely demanded anything from a man. People did. People asked whether he was eating enough, whether the roof still leaked over the back bedroom, whether he planned to come to Thanksgiving dinner this year, whether living alone, all the way out there, was still such a good idea. Grant had one answer for most of those questions. I can handle it. Usually that ended the conversation. He had been a Navy SEAL long enough for self-reliance to become something deeper than training, and he had been a widower long enough for it to become habit. His wife, Elaine, had been gone for years. The house still carried small pieces of her in places he had never bothered to change. A blue ceramic bowl she had hated but refused to throw away. A narrow table by the window with one leg slightly shorter than the others. A row of hooks near the mudroom door, one of them still holding an old green scarf that no longer smelled like anything. Grant did not spend his days staring at those things. That would have been easier to understand. He simply lived around them. He cooked one portion, washed one plate, split his own firewood, repaired his own gutters, drove into town every Thursday morning for groceries, and came home before noon. If a neighbor offered to help with something, Grant thanked them and declined. Not because he disliked people. He simply preferred debts that could be measured in dollars. Those were easier. That afternoon, he left the house on foot a little after 3. He wore an old olive-drab combat shirt under a dark field jacket, faded work pants, winter boots, and a charcoal wool cap, pulled low over brown hair, going silver at the temples. The shirt had long ago stopped being military clothing in his mind. It was just something that fit well, moved easily, and had survived enough washing to become soft. His field watch read 3:17 when the first heavier flakes began to fall. Grant noticed. He kept walking. The road curved gradually toward the pine woods, passing an abandoned pasture and a line of old fencing that had been repaired. So many times it was impossible to tell which boards belonged to which decade. Snow made almost no sound as it landed. That was what Grant liked about it. Rain announced itself. Wind argued. Snow simply arrived. He had gone another half-mile when something red appeared through the trees. At first, Grant thought it was a road marker. Then he got closer. It was too large, too irregular, and far too far from the road. Grant slowed. The object stood near an old fence where the pasture rose into a low bank. It was a section of wooden barn door, maybe 3 feet wide and nearly 5 feet long, painted a deep red that had faded around the edges. Someone had propped it diagonally against the bank. Not carelessly, deliberately, like a wall. Grant's eyes narrowed. Then something beside it moved. He stopped. A German shepherd lay pressed against the base of the red board. Female. Adult. Black and tan. Even from 30 feet away, Grant could see that she was too thin. Snow collected along her back and shoulders. Her dark saddle had gone white in patches, and the lighter fur around her legs was damp and clumped. Her right ear stood straight, the left tilted slightly outward at the tip. The dog raised her head. Her eyes locked on Grant. Amber brown. Watchful. Not wild. Not friendly either. Grant stood still. The shepherd tried to rise. Her front legs straightened first, then the back. They trembled so badly that for a moment Grant thought she would collapse. She did not retreat. Instead, she moved sideways. 1 step, then another, placing herself directly in front of the narrow opening behind the board. Grant watched the motion carefully. That changed everything. A frightened stray would have backed away. A territorial dog might have advanced. This one did neither. She blocked. Grant slipped one glove off and slowly lowered himself into a crouch. Easy. The dog stared at him. Grant did not reach for her. He had seen enough working dogs in his life to understand that frightened animals did not need speeches. They needed space. He removed a small packet of dried beef from his coat pocket. It was supposed to be his snack for the walk. He tore it open, placed several pieces on the snow, then moved backward. The shepherd did not move. Grant waited. Snow collected on his shoulders. His knees began to ache slightly from crouching. He waited anyway. After perhaps a minute, the dog lowered her head. 1 step. She took a piece. Chewed. Paused. Looked at Grant. Then took another. But even while eating, her body remained angled toward the red board. She would not turn her back on it. Grant noticed that too. "You're guarding something." The dog's ears shifted. A gust came down from the trees. It caught the edge of the board and made the old wood creak. And underneath that sound came something else. So faint Grant almost dismissed it. A thin cry. He went completely still. There it was again. Not from the adult dog. From behind her. Grant felt the air in his chest change. He stopped seeing the shepherd as an exhausted animal beside a piece of debris. Now he saw the arrangement. The bank. The board. The angle against the wind. The packed snow near the opening. The dog lying across it. This was shelter. Crude, but intentional. Grant shifted slightly to the side. The shepherd stiffened. Easy. He kept his hands visible. From that angle, he could see past the dog. Behind the red board was a shallow depression cut into the earth, lower than the surrounding snow. Straw lined the bottom. 2 old wool blankets had been folded into the hollow, and inside them were 3 puppies. German shepherds. Maybe 5 weeks old. They lay pressed so tightly together that, at first glance, Grant could barely distinguish one body from the next. One tiny black muzzle lifted. Another puppy moved under the blanket. The third gave the weak sound he had heard. Grant exhaled slowly. The adult shepherd turned her head toward them. For the first time since he had seen her, The hard vigilance in her face softened. Only for a second. Then she looked back at Grant. Something about that look reached him in a place he preferred not to visit. Not fear. Not pleading. Responsibility. Grant had seen it in people before. People who were nearly finished themselves but were still checking on everyone else. Elaine had looked at him that way, once from a hospital bed after a night when she had barely slept. "Have you eaten?" She had been the one with an IV in her arm, and she had asked whether he had eaten. Grant pushed the memory aside before it could fully form. He opened his pack. Inside was a compact emergency blanket, a thermos, an extra pair of socks, a flashlight, and a few things most people would have considered excessive for an afternoon walk. Grant considered them normal. He unfolded the thermal blanket and moved slowly toward the board. The shepherd's lips tightened. Not a growl. A warning. Grant stopped immediately. "I'm not taking them." The absurdity of explaining himself to a dog did not bother him. He waited again. Then, rather than reach into the hollow, he secured one edge of the thermal blanket against the outside of the board, and anchored the other beneath a fallen branch, covering the largest opening where the wind was getting through. The difference was immediate. The loose wool blanket inside stopped fluttering. The puppies settled. The shepherd watched every movement. When Grant finished, he backed away. Only then did she lie down again. Not relaxed, but no longer fighting to remain standing. Grant looked more closely at the shelter. The red board had not been dragged here by the dog. Too heavy. Someone had built this. Someone who understood wind direction. Someone who had brought straw. Blankets. Food, perhaps. Someone had expected to come back. Grant knelt beside the outer edge of the hollow. He did not touch the puppies. He only lifted the corner of one blanket, enough to check that all three were breathing normally. Something dark underneath caught his eye. Fabric. Grant reached carefully and pulled it free. A wool cap. Gray. Old. A man's. The shepherd's head lifted immediately. Grant turned the cap in his hands. Inside, along the lower seam, someone had stitched a name in uneven block letters. Walter Finch. Grant stared at it. He knew the name. Not well. Walter Finch was 74, give or take a year, and lived in a small house beyond the abandoned rail spur behind the woods. A retired carpenter. Lean. White-haired. Always buying screws, wood oil, saw blades, or some odd piece of hardware from Miller's Supply. Grant had spoken to him a handful of times. Once about cedar shingles. Once about a warped fence gate. Once when Walter had spent 10 full minutes explaining why modern hinges were designed by people who hated doors. Grant had liked him immediately, which was probably why he had never made much effort to become his friend. Walter was also famous for refusing help. Grant almost smiled at the thought. Then the smile disappeared. Walter's hat was here. His dog was here. 3 puppies were here. Walter was not. Grant stood and looked toward the darkening trees. The snow was falling harder now. Any tracks that had existed were fading by the minute. He looked back at the shepherd. She watched him. Grant brought the hat closer. The dog's reaction was instant. Her head lifted. Both ears came forward, even the slightly crooked left one. She stood again, though her legs shook. Then she turned her body toward the forest. Not toward the road. Not toward town. Toward the pines. Grant followed her gaze. A narrow path disappeared between the trees, already filling with snow. The shepherd looked back at him once. Grant slipped Walter's cap into his jacket. He checked his watch. Then the sky. Then the dog. The walk he had planned for himself was over. Something else had taken its place. Grant tightened the strap on his pack. "Show me." The shepherd turned toward the forest, and Grant followed. Grant did not move immediately. The German shepherd had already turned toward the pines, but her body told a different story than her intention. Her front legs were steady enough. The rear ones trembled every time she shifted her weight. She wanted to go. That did not mean she could. Grant crouched beside the shelter and opened his pack again. The 3 puppies could not remain exposed if he had to leave the roadside. He folded the emergency blanket into the bottom of his insulated carrier, added one of the wool layers from the hollow, then transferred the puppies one at a time. He worked slowly. The mother watched every movement. The smallest puppy protested with a thin squeak when Grant lifted him. The shepherd rose halfway, then stopped. Grant looked at her. "I know." He settled the puppy beside the others. They immediately pressed back together. Warmth first. Everything else after. Grant closed the top enough to shield them from wind while leaving ventilation along the side. Then he lifted Walter Finch's wool cap from inside his jacket and held it near the shepherd's nose. Her reaction came before thought. She stood. Not cleanly. Her hind quarters dipped once, recovered, and then she started toward the trees. Grant shouldered the carrier. Easy. The shepherd ignored the suggestion. That made him almost smile. He followed. The path into the pines was little more than a break between trunks. Snow had filled most of the old depressions, and the afternoon light was already thinning beneath the branches. The dog moved in short sections. 20 yards. Stop. Listen. Another 15. Stop again. She did not nose the ground dramatically or circle as if performing for him. Most of the time she simply chose a direction, moved until her strength failed, then stood breathing hard. Grant let her set the first part of the route. He did not let her set the pace. After several minutes, he noticed the first useful sign. A torn brown paper sack lay half buried beside a stump. Grant bent and pulled it free. 3 pieces of dry dog food remained trapped in the folded bottom. He looked ahead at the shepherd. She had stopped 20 feet away. Her head was turned toward him. "Your man came this way." The dog blinked snow from her lashes. Grant tucked the paper into his pack, rather than leave it in the woods, and continued. Farther on, the trail descended toward lower ground. The trees opened enough for wind to come through sideways. The shepherd faltered. Grant watched her closely now. The left rear leg slipped once. Then again. She kept going. A man could admire determination and still know when it had become dangerous. Grant had learned that lesson later in life than he preferred. He caught up to her. Enough. The dog continued another 2 steps. Then both hind legs folded. She dropped into the snow. Not dramatically. She simply had nothing left. Grant set the carrier down immediately. The shepherd tried to rise. He placed one hand against her shoulder. Not forcing, just preventing her from wasting what little strength remained. No. She made a low sound in her throat. Not aggression. Frustration. Grant understood that sound better than he wanted to. "I said no." She pushed once against his palm. Weakly. Then stopped. Grant looked around. 30 yards uphill, a cluster of granite broke the wind. Between two rocks was a shallow pocket where snow had not accumulated as deeply. It would do. He carried the puppies there first, keeping the insulated carrier closed against the wind. Then he returned for the shepherd. She did not like being lifted. Her body went rigid for 2 seconds before exhaustion defeated pride. Grant carried her beneath the rocks and lowered her onto the thermal blanket. He placed the carrier beside her and opened the top. 3 small heads shifted inside. The shepherd immediately stretched her neck toward them. There. That was enough to settle her. Grant placed Walter's cap beside her front paws. He had no idea whether the smell helped. But the dog lowered her muzzle to it. Grant checked the time. Then he looked into the woods. The trail ahead no longer belonged to the dog. Now it belonged to whatever Walter had left behind. Grant stood. "I'll find him." The shepherd watched him. He almost added something reassuring. Instead, he tightened his pack straps and went. Without the dog, the woods felt larger. The path split twice. At the first fork, Grant found nothing. At the second, he saw a shallow groove crossing the snow. Not a footprint. A drag mark. Something wooden had struck the ground repeatedly, as someone walked. Grant followed it. 20 yards later, he found half of a walking stick. Ash wood. Hand-shaped grip. Broken cleanly near the middle. He turned it over. There were fresh scuffs on one side. Grant looked downslope. The land fell away toward the abandoned rail corridor. He moved faster. Not reckless. Just faster. The old trackbed appeared between the trees like a dark seam under the snow. The rails had been removed years earlier, but rotting ties remained in places, along with drainage ditches and sections of old livestock fencing. Grant stopped and listened. Wind. Branches. Then something else. A voice. Barely more than breath. "Hey." Grant turned toward the ditch. "Walter?" Silence. Then, "Here." He found him 30 yards downslope. Walter Finch lay half on his side, in an old drainage cut, one boot trapped between 2 collapsed fence rails and a wedge of frozen earth. His canvas coat was dusted white. His wool shirt beneath it showed at the collar, dark burgundy against his pale neck. Grant recognized him immediately. Walter looked smaller than he did standing behind a hardware store counter. Age did that to people, when the ground took away their posture. His face was narrow and weathered, his white-gray hair flattened on one side, his mustache wet with melted snow. His eyes were still clear. That mattered. Grant slid into the ditch. Walter looked past him. "Sadie?" Not hello. Not thank God. Sadie. Grant knelt. "She's alive." Walter closed his eyes. "The pups?" "All 3. The tension left his face so visibly that Grant felt it more than saw it. "Good." Grant looked at the trapped leg. "Don't move yet." "I've heard that one for 3 hours." "Then you've had practice." Walter opened one eye. "You always this friendly?" "Only when somebody ignores good advice." For the first time, Walter's mouth moved. Almost a smile. Good. A man who could still be annoyed was usually doing better than a man who could not. Grant checked the boot, then the angle of the knee. Walter's leg was not crushed. The problem was leverage. One rail had fallen across the outside of the boot, while the other pinned the ankle against hard ground. Trying to yank free could turn a manageable injury into a serious one. Grant pulled off one glove and pressed 2 fingers above the boot line. Feel that? Yes. Your toes? Yes. Can you move them? Walter tried. Some. Grant nodded. Good. Walter watched him. You know what you're doing. Enough to know what I'm not doing. And what's that? Pulling you out like a fence post. Walter let out a breath that might have been laughter. Then he started shivering again. That concerned Grant more. He reached for his emergency radio. The signal took 2 tries. County Volunteer Fire, this is Keller. I have an injured adult male near the old Finch rail spur, south drainage cut. Conscious, possible ankle or lower leg injury, cold exposure. Static. Then a voice. Grant? He recognized Caleb Monroe immediately. Caleb was 60, broad through the shoulders, quick speaking, and had spent enough years running the volunteer fire crew that half the county knew his voice before they knew his face. Yeah. You with Walter? Grant glanced down. Apparently. Walter muttered, That sounds judgmental. Grant ignored him. Caleb continued, We've got a pine across County 12. Crew's cutting it now. I can get to the north access once it's clear. 20, maybe 30. Understood. Check circulation below the trap. Don't torque the leg. Keep him off direct snow if you can. Already doing it. Of course you are. The radio went quiet for a second. Then Caleb added, Keep him talking. Walter heard that. I object. Caleb's voice crackled through the speaker. Good, means you're still Walter. Grant almost smiled. He shut the radio off. Then he pulled a folded pad from his pack and worked it beneath Walter's upper body, separating him from the frozen ground. Walter watched him. You carry a whole house in that thing? Only the useful rooms. That got an actual breath of laughter. It did not last. Walter's face changed when he looked toward the trees. Grant noticed. What happened? Walter's eyes stayed there. Roof over Sadie's pen gave way this morning. Snow load. Grant waited. I moved her and the pups out. That red door panel was the fastest thing I had big enough to block the west wind. Put straw down, blankets. You went back for food. And another blanket. Walter's jaw tightened. Should waited. Grant did not agree. He did not disagree. Walter continued. Slipped coming back, stick snapped. He nodded toward the broken fence around them. Ended up here. And Sadie? Walter was quiet. Then something shifted in his face. Not embarrassment. Something more private. She found me. Grant looked at him. Walter swallowed once. She came all the way out here. The wind moved over the ditch. Walter stared at nothing for a moment. I told her to go home. Grant said nothing. She wouldn't. Walter's voice had changed. Softer now. I yelled at her. Another pause. First time I ever had to. Grant pictured the exhausted shepherd standing in front of that red board. Walter continued. Told her home, over and over. She finally listened. Walter nodded. Worst good thing she ever did. That sentence stayed between them. Grant understood it immediately. Sometimes love meant staying. Sometimes it meant leaving, because somebody weaker was waiting for you. The problem was that both could feel like betrayal while you were doing them. Grant looked away first. The next 20 minutes passed slowly. Grant kept Walter talking. Not about the cold. About carpentry. Walter complained about manufactured cabinets. He complained about cheap pine, pretending to be furniture. He complained about screws that stripped too easily and hinges made of decorative aluminum nonsense. The more irritated he became, the more Grant relaxed. Then Walter said, "Sorry." Grant looked over. "For what?" "This." Walter gestured vaguely at the ditch. "You had somewhere else to be." Grant stared at him. It was such a small sentence, and it landed harder than it had any right to. Elaine had said it from a hospital chair once. "Sorry you have to keep driving me." Another time from the bedroom. "Sorry you have to help me up." And once quietly, on a morning when her hands had been too weak to hold the coffee pot steady. "Sorry." Grant had hated the word then. He hated it now. "Don't." Walter blinked. "What?" "Don't apologize." Walter studied him. Grant immediately regretted the sharpness in his voice. But Walter did not seem offended. Instead, he looked almost curious. Everybody gets tired of being somebody else's problem eventually. Grant's jaw tightened. "That what you think?" Walter looked toward the gray sky. "That's what age teaches if you're paying attention." Grant wanted to argue, but the memory of Elaine was still too close. He had spent years believing her apologies were unnecessary. He had never spent much time asking why she had felt compelled to make them. Now Walter had given him the answer without meaning to. Not shame. Fear. Fear that needing someone long enough would change the way they looked at you. Grant lowered his eyes to the snow. Before he could respond, the radio cracked. "Grant, we're 2 minutes out." He reached for it. "Copy." Soon the sound of boots came through the trees. Caleb Monroe appeared first, wearing a dark red rescue jacket with reflective striping, a black wool cap, and the heavy gray mustache Grant remembered from town meetings. A younger volunteer followed carrying a medical pack and compact lifting tools. Caleb slid into the ditch. "Walter." "Caleb, you look terrible." "So do you." "Excellent. Cognition intact." They worked without drama. The younger volunteer stabilized Walter's leg, while Caleb used a compact pry bar and block to lift the broken fence rail only enough to release pressure. Grant controlled the boot and ankle. "Ready?" Walter nodded. 1, 2, 3. The foot came free. Walter inhaled sharply. But that was all. No catastrophic injury. No impossible rescue. Just careful hands and the right leverage. They splinted the ankle before moving him. When they finally got Walter onto the rescue sled, Caleb started toward the access trail. Walter caught Grant's sleeve. "Wait." Grant looked down. Walter's grip was surprisingly firm. "Sadie." Caleb turned. "Walter, we should get you checked first." "No." "Your leg." "I know where my leg is." Caleb sighed. Walter looked only at Grant. "Take me to her." Grant thought of the dog beneath the rocks, Walter's cap under her muzzle, 3 puppies pressed against her body. He understood that no explanation would change this. More importantly, he was not sure one should. Grant nodded. "All right." Walter released his sleeve. Grant turned toward the trees. Not toward town. Not toward the clinic. Toward Sadie. And for once, he did not argue with a man simply because he knew a safer answer. The medical station smelled like antiseptic, wet wool, and coffee that had been sitting too long. Walter Finch hated all 3. Grant could tell from the way the old man kept glancing toward the door, as if he were measuring the distance to it. The examination itself was less dramatic than the trip that had brought him there. No fracture. No ligament tear severe enough to require surgery. A badly sprained ankle, mild dehydration, and enough cold exposure to concern the nurse without frightening her. Walter took the news with the expression of a man being informed that a machine part could still be repaired. "So I can go home." The nurse, a woman in her 50s with silver-framed glasses, and the patience of someone who had heard this sentence from stubborn men before, did not even look up from the chart. "No." Walter frowned. That wasn't a question. Neither was my answer. Grant looked away before Walter could accuse him of enjoying this. He was. A little. The problem was that home was not currently much of a home. Caleb had checked the property while the road crew worked nearby. A heavy branch had torn down the power line behind Walter's house, and part of the small shelter where Sadie had been staying with the puppies was no longer usable. The community center had opened as an emergency warming shelter for people displaced by the storm, but animals were not being accepted except for service dogs. There were kennels at the veterinary office. Walter refused. Grant understood why before Walter said a word. Sadie had spent the afternoon being separated from everything she cared about. Walter was not going to make her spend the night in a cage somewhere unfamiliar. So there were only a few realistic options. Grant's house was one of them. Unfortunately, it was also the best one. By the time they left the medical station, Grant had accepted this in the same way a man accepts weather. Not happily. Not angrily. Just as fact. His house had never seemed particularly quiet to him before. It did now. Not because it was silent. Because it wasn't. Walter occupied the sofa with one ankle wrapped and elevated on two folded blankets. Sadie lay on the floor, directly beneath him, close enough that one of Walter's hands could rest between her ears without reaching. The puppies had been placed in a wide wicker firewood basket lined with old towels and a folded wool blanket. Grant moved the basket closer to the hearth. Not too close. Warm enough. Then he stood back and looked at the room. 6 living creatures. He counted himself last. The thought bothered him. He was not sure why. The smallest puppy climbed over the edge of the basket. Grant stared. The puppy dropped clumsily onto the rug, stood for a second as if surprised by his own success, then waddled directly toward Grant's chair. No. The puppy continued. Grant bent, picked him up, and placed him back in the basket. Walter watched without comment. 5 minutes later, the same puppy appeared beneath Grant's chair. Grant looked down. 2 oversized paws. A black muzzle. One soft ear folded sideways. The puppy sat on Grant's boot. Grant lifted him again. "Stop." The puppy yawned directly into his hand. Walter's mouth twitched. "He likes you. He likes the fire. He crossed half the room to sit on your foot. He has poor judgment." Walter shifted against the sofa cushion. At our age, liking somebody and liking a warm place probably overlap more than we admit. Grant looked at him. Then, against his will, laughed. It was brief. Barely more than a rough sound from the chest. But it surprised him enough that he stopped. Walter noticed that too. He said nothing. Grant appreciated him for it. The puppy was returned to the basket. Again. The storm stayed for 3 days. Not a violent blizzard anymore. Just persistent snow, intermittent wind, roads closing and reopening, then closing again. That meant proximity. Grant discovered that Walter was incapable of sitting still for long. On the second morning, he found him trying to tighten a loose cabinet hinge while balancing on one good leg. Grant took the screwdriver from his hand. Walter stared at him. What? You're supposed to keep weight off that ankle. I am. You're standing. Mostly on the other one. Grant looked at him. Walter looked back. Then pointed at the cabinet. It was crooked. Grant examined it. The door had, in fact, been hanging a quarter-inch low. You noticed that from the sofa? I'm old, not blind. Grant fixed it. Walter gave instructions the entire time. Top screw first. I know. You loosened the bottom too much. I know. That gap should be even. Grant turned. Do you want the screwdriver? Walter considered. No, I want you to do it correctly. Grant almost smiled. This was becoming a problem. Walter was not fragile. That made everything harder. If he had been frail, confused, helpless, Grant would have known exactly what role to take. Instead, Walter was mentally sharp, deeply competent, and physically less reliable than he wanted anyone to notice. His hands sometimes shook when he reached for a mug. His injured ankle was obvious. The uninjured leg was not as steady as Grant expected either. Walter compensated well. That was what experienced people did. They learned how to hide the correction. Grant had spent years doing the same thing in different ways. On the third afternoon, Walter asked for the small leather bag Grant had placed near the sofa. Medicine? Walter nodded. Grant handed it over. Walter opened the bag, took out 2 prescription bottles, and shook one. Empty. Grant looked at it. Walter noticed. Don't. I didn't say anything. You were about to. Grant leaned against the counter. When did that run out? Yesterday. And the refill. Walter put the bottle back in the bag. Pharmacy has it. Then why don't you? Walter sighed. Because the pharmacy is 40 minutes away. They deliver. Not out to my place. You could have called somebody. Walter looked toward the fire. I can still drive. Not through this. I wasn't planning to drive through this. When were you planning to go? When the road cleared. Grant folded his arms. Walter saw the posture and immediately stiffened. There it was. Not anger yet. Defense. I'm not confused, Keller. I didn't say you were. You're thinking like I am. I'm thinking. You're stretching blood pressure medication because you don't want to ask somebody for a ride. Walter's eyes sharpened. That's my business. Yes. Grant knew he should stop. He did not. And bad business is still bad business. The room went still. Even the puppy in the basket had finally fallen asleep. Walter set the leather bag down carefully. I needed help one day. Grant's jaw tightened. Walter continued. That does not mean I need somebody managing the rest of my life. I'm not managing your life. Not yet. The words landed harder than Grant expected. He straightened. Walter's voice stayed level. That made it worse. People start small. Grant did not interrupt. They say they'll pick up a prescription. Walter glanced toward the window. Then they want a key, just in case. He looked back at Grant. Then they decide I shouldn't be climbing the basement stairs. Then driving at night. Then driving at all. Grant opened his mouth. Walter raised a hand. No, listen. Grant closed it. Walter's eyes had lost their humor. Eventually somebody says I shouldn't be living alone. A pause. They'll say it kindly. Another. They'll say they only want what's best. Walter's mouth tightened. And then one morning I wake up and find out everybody else has been deciding what my life is supposed to look like. Grant looked at him. This was not really about medication. He understood that now. Walter looked toward Sadie. The shepherd lifted her head slightly. I know I'm 74. Walter's voice softened. I know exactly what that means. Grant stayed quiet. I just don't want everybody else being more interested in my age than I am. That changed the room. Grant had expected stubbornness. Instead, he got fear. Not fear of falling. Fear of being reduced. That was different. And worse. Grant walked to the kitchen. Not because the conversation was over. Because he needed something to do with his hands. The coffee pot sat on the counter. He reached for it. And suddenly Elaine was there. Not as a ghost. Not dramatically. Just a memory arriving with terrible accuracy. She had stood in their kitchen years earlier. Thinner than she should have been. One hand around the handle of a glass coffee pot. Grant had seen the tremor in her wrist. He had crossed the room and taken it. Let me. Elaine had looked at him. Tired. Irritated. Still completely herself. Grant. You're going to drop it. Maybe. Then let me. She had held his gaze. Are you taking care of me, or are you stopping me from living? He had hated the question. Because he had known she was wrong. At least that was what he had told himself. She had been sick. He had been helping. There was no argument. Except now, years later, Walter Finch was sitting in his living room saying the same thing without using the same words. Grant set the coffee pot down. His hand remained on the handle. Behind him, Walter said nothing. Grant realized with discomfort that the argument had changed. He had entered it, believing the question was whether Walter should ask for help. Now the question was what help became once the person giving it stopped listening. That was less comfortable. Grant turned. Walter was watching him. You all right? Grant gave him a look. Walter shrugged. Thought I'd ask before you started reorganizing my life. Despite himself, Grant laughed once through his nose. Your prescription gets picked up tomorrow. Walter's expression hardened again. Grant raised a hand. You choose who does it. That stopped him. Grant continued. Caleb, me, somebody else. I don't care. Walter studied him. But you don't skip it. Walter looked suspicious. That your compromise? Yes. It's bossy. It's still a compromise. Walter thought for a moment. Caleb. Fine. He's already going into town. Fine. And I pay for gas. Grant stared. Caleb lives 12 minutes from the pharmacy. Gas costs money. Grant shook his head. Do whatever makes you happy. Walter leaned back. That's closer. Grant did not ask closer to what. He already knew. That evening, the house settled into a strange domestic rhythm. Walter drank coffee. Sadie slept. One puppy dreamed noisily. Another chewed the corner of the basket until Grant gave him an old washcloth instead. The smallest one escaped again. Grant saw him coming this time. He did not move. The puppy reached his chair, climbed halfway onto Grant's boot, failed, and settled across the toe instead. Grant looked down. Walter saw. You're not putting him back? He'll wake up if I move him. Walter nodded gravely. Of course. Don't. I said nothing. Grant rested his hands around his coffee mug. For years, control had felt practical to him. Useful. A way of keeping disaster outside the door. He had controlled schedules, medication, repairs, routes, contingencies. He had believed that if he could do enough, anticipate enough, carry enough, then fewer things would be taken from him. Elaine had still died. That fact had not taught him to stop controlling things. It had taught him to get better at it. Grant looked across the room at Walter. The old carpenter had one injured ankle, one empty prescription bottle, a dog with 3 puppies, and absolutely no interest in being turned into a project. Grant understood something then that he had not wanted to understand before. Maybe helping someone was not always about knowing what needed to be done. Maybe sometimes it was about knowing where your authority ended. He looked down. The puppy was asleep on his boot. Grant let him stay there. For the first time in a very long while, something in his house was out of place. And Grant chose not to correct it. By the 4th morning, the storm had lost its temper. Snow still drifted from the roofs and lay deep across the fields, but the wind had dropped to a low, steady breath, and the sky over northern Idaho had turned the pale blue that came after bad weather. Cold, clean, almost innocent. Walter stood at Grant's front window with one hand on the sill. His ankle was still wrapped. He leaned more heavily on the cane than he wanted anyone to notice. Grant noticed anyway. He did not mention it. That in itself was progress. Caleb Monroe arrived just after 9 in an old county truck with a shovel rattling in the bed and a thermos wedged between the seats. He stepped inside long enough to announce that Walter's power line had been made safe, though full service would take another day. "The back corner of the shed looks worse than it is," Caleb said. "Roof panels gone. 2 rafters cracked. Main house is fine." Walter pulled on his coat. "Then I'm going home." Caleb looked at Grant. Grant looked at Walter. Walter narrowed his eyes. "Don't." Grant lifted both hands. "I didn't say anything. You were about to. I was thinking." That's usually where trouble starts. Caleb took a drink from his thermos. "I'm staying out of this." "Coward," Walter said. "Experienced." They left 10 minutes later. Sadie rode in the back seat beside Walter, one front paw resting against his boot. The puppies traveled in the insulated carrier at Grant's feet. The smallest one complained most of the way. Grant looked down once. The puppy stopped. Grant looked forward. The puppy began again. Walter heard it. "He knows you're weak." Grant kept his eyes on the road. "He's 5 weeks old. Still knows." Walter's property sat beyond the old rail spur, where the land flattened toward a line of spruce. The house was smaller than Grant remembered. Not neglected. Just old. A single-story place with pale siding, a narrow porch, and a workshop attached to the rear by a covered breezeway. The yard held stacks of split firewood under tarps, a snow-buried wheelbarrow, and several lengths of cedar leaned neatly against the workshop wall. Everything had a place. Even in winter. That told Grant more about Walter than most conversations had. Caleb was already on the roof when they arrived, checking the damage above the back utility line. Another vehicle stood near the porch. Dark green. County plates. A woman in a heavy navy field coat was kneeling beside the puppy carrier. Walter slowed. "Nora." The woman looked up. Dr. Nora Bell was 46, with chestnut hair tied low at the back of her neck, and a few pale strands beginning at the temples. She had the compact, practical way of moving, of someone accustomed to working around frightened animals and impatient owners. She stood. "I heard you decided to test whether frozen drainage ditches are softer than they look." Walter gave her a flat look. "Caleb talks too much." "He does." Nora turned to Grant. "You must be Keller." Grant nodded. "Grant." "Nora." That was enough introduction for both of them. She knelt again and opened the carrier. Sadie immediately moved closer. Nora did not reach for her. She waited. Sadie sniffed her hand, then allowed it. "Good girl," Nora said quietly. Walter watched the whole exchange. Grant noticed that too. Some people watch doctors. Walter watched how people touched Sadie. Nora checked the puppies first, weighing each one with a portable scale and listening to their breathing. Cold stress, but they came through better than I expected. Walter exhaled. Nora moved to Sadie. The shepherd stood still while Nora checked her gums, hydration, abdomen, and paws. "She needs food in smaller amounts for the next day or two," Nora said. "Not one huge meal. Her system's been running hard." Walter nodded. "I know." Nora glanced at him. "You know now." Walter did not answer. Grant sensed history, not conflict. Familiarity. Nora scratched gently behind Sadie's right ear. "This wasn't exactly the plan when you took her." Grant looked over. Walter's face changed just slightly. Nora continued without drama. 3 months ago, Walter agreed to take one dog. She looked at Grant. Sadie belonged to an old friend of his late wife. The man had to move into assisted living after a stroke and couldn't keep her. Walter stared at the floorboards. "I told him I'd take her." Nora nodded. "And 6 weeks later I told Walter he had not taken one dog." Grant looked at Sadie. Pregnant. Already well along. Walter rubbed a hand across his face. "She hid it well." Nora smiled faintly. "You didn't look. I was feeding her." "That is not an ultrasound." Grant almost smiled. Walter pointed at Nora. "This is why I don't like professionals. You like me fine. I tolerate you because you have useful equipment." Nora turned back to Sadie. But the humor had opened something. Grant now understood the arithmetic Walter had been doing. 1 dog had become 4. 1 promise had become a household. Not because Walter had chosen recklessly. Because life had changed the terms after he agreed. That was different. And harder. Later that afternoon, Caleb worked outside on the damaged power line connection, while Grant helped Walter move a few things away from the broken section of the shelter. Walter refused to sit for more than 10 minutes at a time. Grant no longer told him to. Instead, he moved the heavier objects before Walter reached them. That irritated Walter less. Not much less, but less. "Insurance papers are in the desk," Walter said. "Top left drawer." Grant went inside. Sadie lay near the kitchen doorway, with the puppies tucked beside her. The house smelled faintly of cedar, coffee, and old wood. Walter's desk stood in a small room off the kitchen. Built by hand. Of course. Grant opened the top left drawer. There were folders. Receipts. A tape measure. 2 pencils sharpened with a knife. And a large white envelope marked with the name of a regional German Shepherd rescue organization. Grant froze. Sadie's name was printed in the corner. He did not open it. He simply took the insurance folder from beneath it and carried both to the kitchen. Walter came in behind him. Grant set the insurance papers on the table. Then the envelope. "What's this?" Walter stopped. The change in him was immediate. Not guilt. Not surprise. Recognition. He sat down slowly. Grant waited. Walter picked up the envelope himself. Opened it. Inside were forms. Intake information. Transfer notes. An unsigned placement agreement. Grant read only what Walter turned toward him. No more. "When?" Grant asked. "After the pups were old enough." Grant looked at Sadie. She was asleep. One puppy had crawled halfway across her front leg. "You were going to give her up?" Walter looked at the papers. "No." Grant waited. Walter lifted his eyes. "That's the problem." The room went quiet. Outside, Caleb dropped something metal and cursed. Neither man reacted. Walter folded the paperwork once, then unfolded it. "I've fallen twice this year." Grant said nothing. "Before the ditch." He held up 2 fingers. "Once in the kitchen, once behind the workshop." "Were you hurt?" "No." Walter's mouth tightened. "Not enough to matter." Grant knew that phrase. It meant enough to remember. Walter looked at Sadie. "I'm 74. He said it without self-pity. "Some mornings I feel 60. A pause. "Some mornings I feel 90. Grant leaned against the counter. Walter continued. "I know how this works." "What works?" "Time." He gave a small shrug. "You lose things in pieces." There was no bitterness in his voice. That made it worse. "First balance, then distance, then maybe the truck, then maybe the stairs." He looked toward the workshop window. "Doesn't mean tomorrow. Doesn't mean next year." His fingers tightened around the rescue papers. "But it means eventually." Grant understood now why the forms were unsigned. Walter had prepared for a future he hated. That was not the same as wanting it. Walter looked down at Sadie. "She waits for me." Grant followed his gaze. Walter's voice lowered. "That dog waits at the workshop door, when I'm 10 minutes late coming inside." He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the envelope. "If I'm in the shower too long, she sits outside the bathroom." A faint smile appeared. "She's ridiculous." Grant said nothing. Walter's smile disappeared. "One day I could go to bed and not wake up." The sentence came without drama. It was simply placed between them. Grant did not interrupt. Walter looked directly at him. "You know what scares me?" Grant thought he did. He was wrong. Not dying. Walter looked toward Sadie again. "I've had 74 years. That's more than a lot of good people get." His eyes stayed on the dog. "What scares me is her sitting beside the bed, waiting." Grant felt something tighten in his chest. Walter continued. "One day." His voice went quieter. 2. A pause. Longer. He swallowed. Thinking, "I'm going to get up." Sadie shifted in her sleep. Walter looked away. "I won't have that." Now Grant understood the papers. They were not abandonment. They were prevention. Walter was trying to protect Sadie from a future in which his love became a trap. And that was exactly why he could not sign them. Grant had spent years believing that love meant preventing the worst outcome. Walter had arrived at the same conclusion from the opposite side. The difference was that Walter was willing to lose Sadie to make sure she would not be left waiting for him. Grant looked at the forms, then at Walter. A week earlier, he would have told him what to do. Maybe move closer to town. Maybe let someone check in. Maybe stop driving in winter. Maybe give someone a key. All reasonable. All answers. Instead, Grant asked a question. If you didn't have to leave this house? Walter looked up. Grant continued. And Sadie didn't have to leave you. He nodded toward the papers. What would have to change for that to be safe? Walter stared at him. Grant could almost see the old man, searching for the hidden instruction. There wasn't one. No one's asked me that. Grant shrugged slightly. What do they ask? Walter gave a dry laugh. They don't. He leaned back. They tell me. Grant understood. What you should stop doing. Where you should live. What you should give up. When you should surrender the keys. All in the language of concern. Walter looked toward the window. I don't know. Grant nodded. Okay. Walter looked back. That's it? For now. You don't have a plan? Grant almost smiled. I'm trying something new. Walter studied him. Then, slowly, he placed the unsigned rescue papers back inside the envelope. Not torn. Not discarded. Just set aside. That mattered. Because nothing had been solved. Not yet. But the question had changed. They were no longer asking whether Walter was capable of continuing exactly as he had. He wasn't. And they were no longer asking whether aging meant losing everything before anything went wrong. It didn't have to. They were asking something more difficult. What could change without taking Walter's life away from him? What could remain? Who could help? And who got to decide? Walter rested one hand on the envelope. Coffee first. Grant nodded. That sounds like a plan. Walter looked toward the kitchen. You're making it. Grant raised an eyebrow. I thought you didn't want me managing your life. Walter stood carefully. Coffee isn't my life. Then he paused. At the moment. Grant laughed. This time, Walter did too. Sadie raised her head at the sound. Then laid it back down beside her puppies. And for the first time since Grant had found her beneath the red board, she looked like a dog who believed, at least for one afternoon, that everyone she was responsible for was exactly where they were supposed to be. Grant did not make a list of people who could help Walter. He made Walter make one. That distinction mattered. They sat at Walter's kitchen table 2 mornings after the conversation about Sadie, with a yellow legal pad between them and coffee cooling in mismatched mugs. Outside, the sky had cleared completely. Sunlight lay hard and bright across the snow, turning the yard into something almost cheerful despite the damaged shelter, the stacked lumber, and the temporary orange cable running toward the house. Walter held the pencil. Grant did not. Roof, Grant said. Walter wrote nothing. Chimney. Nothing. Rear steps. Walter looked up. You planning to let me participate in this? I thought that's what the pencil was for. Walter tapped it against the table. You're naming jobs. I'm naming problems. That's worse. Grant leaned back. All right. Walter waited. Grant corrected himself. What do you want somebody else handling? That got a response. Walter looked toward the window. High roof work. Grant nodded. Walter wrote it down. The chimney inspection. Another line. Anything involving that north fence if the ground's frozen. Grant raised an eyebrow. You hate that fence. I hate it enough not to die fixing it. That counted as progress too. They went down the page slowly. Walter chose. Not Grant. Caleb Monroe got the winter safety jobs. Roof checks, chimney draft, loose fencing, the slick section of packed ground between the workshop and back porch. Dr. Nora Bell would continue monitoring Sadie and the puppies, manage vaccinations when the time came, and coordinate with the German Shepherd Rescue Network for eventual placements. Walter did not love that last part, but he wrote it himself. Then Grant asked, "What about food and errands?" Walter immediately stopped writing. No. Grant waited. No what? No system. You're the one holding the pencil. I know what you're doing. I'm sitting. You're sitting strategically. Grant almost smiled. Walter pointed the pencil at him. I can cook. I know. I can shop. Sometimes. Walter's eyes narrowed. Grant held up a hand. Your list. Walter lowered the pencil. They left the line blank. For the moment. Helen Marlowe solved it 3 days later by refusing to call help. She arrived just before noon in a slate blue parka with a mustard scarf wrapped around her neck and a steel thermos under one arm. Grant was outside splitting old boards from the damaged shelter when her SUV pulled into Walter's drive. Helen was 68, short enough that the shovel in her cargo area looked almost oversized beside her, with a round face, hazel eyes, and silver-brown hair cut to her jaw. She moved briskly, not hurried. There was a difference. She walked past Grant. You Keller? Yes. Good. She kept walking. Grant watched her go. Walter opened the front door before she could knock. His face immediately became suspicious. What's that? Helen lifted the thermos. Soup. No. She stopped on the porch. I haven't offered it yet. You're about to. I was. No. Helen looked past him into the house. Sadie was lying in the living room with the puppies. Her expression softened for half a second. Then she looked back at Walter. Fine. Walter seemed almost disappointed that the argument had ended so quickly. Helen continued. I bring soup twice a week. No. You repair 2 dining chairs. Walter paused. Grant stopped working. This was worth hearing. Walter folded his arms. Legs or seats? Both. That's 4 jobs. 2 chairs. 4 problems. Helen considered that. Then I add bread. Walter rubbed his chin. What kind? Sourdough. Homemade? Don't be ridiculous. Walter looked offended. Helen said bakery in town. Walter thought about it, then stepped aside. Put the soup in the kitchen. Helen walked in. Grant went back to the boards before either of them caught him smiling. That was how the arrangement began. Not generosity. Not rescue. A trade. Helen had spent nearly 20 years with German Shepherds. Her last one, a sable male named Mason, had died 3 years earlier. She did not tell Walter this as a sad confession. She mentioned it while checking whether one of Sadie's puppies was chewing too aggressively on the edge of a blanket. He used to eat socks, Helen said. Walter looked horrified. A shepherd? Champion bloodline. Still ate socks? Expensive ones. Walter nodded slowly. Humbling. Helen smiled. It was the first time Grant saw Walter treat someone's presence as ordinary rather than tolerated. That mattered more than the soup. Over the following week, the property changed without becoming unrecognizable. Caleb marked the bad section of roof and came back with another volunteer to repair it. Nora stopped by twice. Helen appeared with soup on Tuesday and Thursday. True to his side of the agreement, Walter worked on her dining chairs from a stool in the workshop, refusing to let Grant touch the joinery. Grant's assignments remained narrow. High places. Heavy wood. Tuesday coffee. Walter had added that one himself. "You drink too much coffee," Grant told him. "I drink the correct amount." "What qualifies you to judge?" "Age." "That's not a qualification. At 74 it becomes one." Grant let that pass. The real shift happened around the red board. The damaged shelter needed rebuilding before Sadie, and the puppies could use it again. Grant and Walter worked together in the afternoon sun. New boards were stacked against the fence. The old red panel lay on two sawhorses. Up close, it looked worse than Grant remembered. One corner had split. The lower edge was soft from old moisture. A crack ran almost 18 inches through the center. Grant pressed a thumb against the damaged wood. "This goes." Walter looked over. "No." Grant tapped the rotten edge. "It's done." Walter set down his measuring square. "It did its job. That doesn't make it good lumber." Walter walked closer. "It doesn't make the whole thing bad lumber either." Grant looked at him. Walter ran one rough hand across the red paint. "Cut the rot. The crack goes halfway through. Then cut around it." "You want to patch a new wall with this?" "Yes." Grant frowned. "It won't match." Walter picked up the carpenter's pencil from behind his ear. Then he looked at Grant. "If everything had to match before it was allowed to stand beside something else, you and I would both be in trouble." Grant stared at him. Walter marked a straight line across the good portion of the board. Grant laughed. Walter did not. "Hold this." They cut away the damaged sections. What remained was smaller, uneven, still red. Walter fitted it into one side of the new shelter wall between clean cedar boards. It looked ridiculous. Grant told him so. Walter stepped back. Sadie came out onto the porch. She watched them. The wind moved lightly through the trees. The red patch sat there, bright and imperfect. Grant looked at it again. Maybe ridiculous was not the same thing as wrong. The weeks that followed settled into routine before either man noticed. Tuesday mornings became Grant's. Helen owned soup days. Nora called before coming because Walter had informed her that veterinary medicine was not exempt from manners. Caleb did not call at all. He simply arrived when something needed checking. No one took Walter's keys. No one moved his furniture. No one decided he should leave. But there were fewer chances for him to vanish into a bad day unnoticed. That was the difference. One Tuesday, Walter showed up at Grant's house, carrying a piece of furniture in the back of Caleb's truck. Grant stood in his driveway. "What is that?" Walter climbed down slowly. "You know what it is?" Grant did. The small side table had been in his garage for years. Elaine's table. Walnut top. Narrow legs. One of the lower braces had split long ago, and the table had begun leaning badly enough that Grant moved it out of the house. He had always intended to repair it. He never had. Walter had noticed it during the storm. Apparently, he had also remembered. "You took that out of my garage? You told me I could use the scrap shelf." "That wasn't scrap." Walter looked at him. "Exactly." Grant went quiet. Walter lowered the tailgate. The repair was subtle. The broken brace had been replaced with a piece of walnut close in age and grain. The join was clean but visible if someone knew where to look. The surface still carried scratches. A pale water ring near one corner. A small burn mark where Elaine had once set a candle too close to the wood. Grant ran his fingers across it. You didn't refinish the top. No. Why? Walter rested both hands on his cane. Did you want me to? Grant looked at the marks. He remembered the water ring. Elaine had blamed herself for it for 3 days. He remembered laughing at her. He remembered the candle too. Christmas Eve. A year when the power went out for 6 hours, and they had eaten dinner by candlelight because there was nothing else to do. No, Grant said. Walter nodded. Then I didn't. Grant touched the repaired brace. It would have looked cleaner. Clean isn't always the same as right. Walter looked at the table. Those marks belonged to it. Grant did not answer. Walter wisely did not keep talking. That evening, after Walter left, Grant stood alone in the garage. The table waited beside the door. For years he had kept it because throwing it away felt disloyal. He had also kept it hidden because seeing it felt worse. That arrangement had seemed reasonable. Until now. Grant carried the table inside. He put it back beside the living room window, where it had once stood. The room changed. Not much. A few square feet. One familiar shape. That was all. Grant stood there for a long moment. Then he placed his coffee mug on the old water ring. For the first time, he did not feel like he was disturbing something sacred. He felt like he was using a table. And strangely, that seemed more respectful. Across the road and through the trees, Walter's new dog shelter stood finished. New cedar. Fresh roof. Strong framing. And one strange piece of faded red wood worked into the side. Nothing matched perfectly anymore. Not the shelter. Not Walter's routines. Not Grant's house. Maybe that was why everything was beginning to feel more lived in. No one had saved Walter Finch. Caleb checked the roof. Nora checked the dogs. Helen brought soup because chairs needed fixing. Grant climbed what Walter should not. Walter repaired what Grant had refused to touch. They stood closer. That was all. And somehow for now, it was enough. By the time the puppies were old enough to leave Sadie, winter had changed its character. The snow still covered the fields, but the hard white of January had softened. Roof lines dripped in the afternoon. Tire tracks stayed visible longer. Somewhere beneath the frozen ground, water had begun moving again. Walter noticed things like that. Grant noticed the puppies. Mostly because they were everywhere. One was always under a chair. One was always trying to climb something. And the smallest one had developed a habit of appearing beside Grant's boots with such consistency that Grant had stopped pretending it was coincidence. Dr. Nora Bell began the placement process the same way she did everything else. Without sentimentality. She arrived at Walter's house, carrying a folder, a tablet, and a bag of vaccination records. "These are not party favors," she said. Walter, seated at the kitchen table, looked offended. "Who said they were? You've spent 3 days describing them to people like antique furniture." "I know furniture." "You don't know people." "I know them enough to be cautious." Nora sat across from him. "Good, then we agree." That was how the interviews began. Not with people choosing puppies. With Nora and Walter deciding whether people were prepared to be chosen by responsibility. Grant stayed out of most of it. He told himself that was deliberate. The truth was less flattering. He did not like thinking about the puppies leaving. Helen Marlowe came first. She arrived wearing her mustard scarf and carrying no soup. Walter noticed immediately. No soup? I'm being evaluated. That's not an excuse. Helen took off her coat. Nora gestured toward a chair. Sit. Helen looked at Walter. He enjoying this? Too much. Walter folded his hands on the table. Nora began. How long have you owned large dogs? 18 years total. German Shepherds specifically. 3. Last one? Mason, died 3 years ago. Walter's expression changed slightly at the name, but Helen continued without ceremony. Degenerative myelopathy. We managed it until his quality of life changed. Nora nodded and made a note. Fenced property? Yes. Fence height? 6 feet. Daily exercise? I walk twice a day unless the road is iced. Veterinary budget? Helen gave her a number. Walter leaned toward Nora. Ask about socks. Helen closed her eyes. Walter. He said Mason ate them. That was once. You said expensive ones. Nora looked between them. Do I need to add sock management to the form? Grant turned toward the window to hide a smile. The questions continued. Food. Training. Visitors. Travel. What Helen would do if the puppy developed hip problems. Who would care for the dog if Helen became ill? At question 12, Helen put both palms flat on the table. Walter. Yous understand I live 8 minutes from here on foot? Walter nodded. Exactly. What does that mean? It means I'll know if you're doing it wrong. Helen stared at him. Then she laughed. Sadie lifted her head from beside the stove. The female puppy nearest Helen crawled over, put one paw against Helen's boot, and began chewing the lace. Helen looked down. Walter said, bad judgment. Helen bent to untangle the puppy. Runs in the family. 3 days later, Nora approved the placement. Helen did not rename the puppy immediately. Walter liked that. She can have time, he said. It was the first time Grant understood that Walter was not trying to keep them frozen as they were. He simply wanted the leaving to mean something. The second placement was quieter. Paul and Denise Rowan drove in from a rural property 12 miles east of town. Both were in their mid-60s. Paul was tall and narrow with a weathered face, and a habit of rubbing his thumb along the side of his coffee mug when thinking. Denise wore her silver hair in a loose braid, and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who did not need to fill silence just because it appeared. They had owned 2 large dogs over 30 years. Their last dog had died the previous spring. They had waited. Not because they were devastated beyond repair. Not because their house had become unbearably empty. They had simply wanted to be sure. They wanted another dog for the right reason. Nora liked that answer. Walter liked it more. You hike, he asked. Paul nodded. 4 or 5 miles most mornings when the weather's decent. Walter looked at Denise. And you? I'm smarter. Paul glanced at her. She goes 3. I come home before. He starts pretending a hill is enjoyable. Walter approved of her immediately. Grant could tell. Nora inspected photographs of their fenced acreage, verified their veterinarian, and spent nearly an hour discussing training expectations. The second puppy, a male with darker markings, and an almost unreasonable interest in shoelaces. Went home with them the following week. No one cried dramatically. Walter stood in the driveway with both hands in his jacket pockets, while Paul secured the travel crate. Denise came back once and hugged him. Walter endured it. Barely. Then the truck drove away. Sadie watched from the porch. She whined once. Walter crouched beside her. He's all right. Sadie looked toward the road for a while longer, then went inside. Grant expected Walter to say something profound. He did not. He made coffee. That felt more honest. 2 puppies had homes. 1 did not. The smallest. The one that had escaped the firewood basket at Grant's house. The one with oversized paws, a darker muzzle, and an ear that never seemed to agree with the other about what direction to face. Nora had 2 possible families interested. Both looked fine on paper. Walter had no objection. Grant definitely had no objection. He said so. Repeatedly. I'm not taking a dog. Walter never argued. That was irritating. Grant would say it while filling Sadie's water bowl. Walter would nod. Grant would say it after replacing a chewed rope toy. Walter would say, I heard you. Grant would say it, while the puppy slept against his left boot. Walter would not even look up. The silence began to feel accusatory. One Tuesday, Grant arrived 25 minutes later than usual. A delivery truck had jackknifed near the county intersection, and traffic had been rerouted. Grant pulled into Walter's driveway at 9:27. He stepped out. The puppy was sitting behind the glass storm door. Waiting. Not jumping. Not barking. Just sitting. Walter appeared behind him. Grant looked through the glass. The puppy stood immediately. His tail started. Walter opened the door. The puppy ran straight past him and planted both front paws against Grant's shin. Grant steadied him. Walter leaned against the frame. You know he can't read a clock. Grant looked down. I know. He knows Tuesday. He knows my truck. Same difference to him. Grant rubbed a hand once over the puppy's head. The left ear folded sideways. Walter did not smile. That somehow made the moment harder to dismiss. The puppy had not performed some miraculous act. He had simply expected Grant to arrive. Grant understood expectation. He also understood what happened when someone stopped arriving. That thought stayed with him longer than he wanted. A few days later, Grant came home carrying groceries. He put milk in the refrigerator, coffee in the cabinet, bread on the counter, then stopped. A stainless steel water bowl sat beside the mudroom door. Grant stared at it. He had purchased it the previous afternoon. There was also a folded old towel beside it, for wet paws. He had put that there too. He opened the pantry. On the lower shelf sat a small bag of puppy food. Grant closed the door, then opened it again, as if the evidence might have rearranged itself. It had not. He stood in the kitchen for nearly a minute. There was something deeply annoying about discovering that your decisions had occurred before you officially made them. The phone rang the next morning. Nora. I have a family in Coeur d'Alene who looks promising. Grant leaned against the kitchen counter. For what? There was a pause. Nora was not kind enough to pretend she misunderstood. The puppy. Grant looked at the water bowl. What family? Retired teacher and her husband. Fenced property. Previous shepherd experience. Good veterinary history. Sounds fine. It does. Another pause. I can schedule the home visit." Grant said nothing. Nora waited. That was another irritating quality she shared with Walter. They both knew how to leave silence alone until the other person became responsible for filling it. Grant looked out the window. Snow was melting along the southern edge of the yard. His old side table, the one Walter had repaired, stood beside the window now. A coffee mug rested on it. The house had changed in small ways. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for Grant. "Nora." "Yes?" "Don't schedule it." Silence. Not surprise silence. Just confirmation. "All right." Grant closed his eyes briefly. "I suppose Walter already told you." "No." Grant opened them. "He didn't?" "No." That surprised him more. Nora continued. "He said it wasn't his decision." Grant looked toward the mudroom. The empty water bowl waited. "Right. So," Nora said, "is this your decision?" Grant exhaled. "Yes." That was all. No music. No revelation. No sense that the world had changed. Just a word spoken into a phone. "Yes." Walter took the news with infuriating calm. Grant arrived that afternoon. The puppy ran to him. Walter was in the workshop sanding the edge of a cabinet door. Grant stood in the doorway. Nora called. Walter kept sanding. "I know Nora. I told her not to continue looking." Walter stopped. Not dramatically. Just stopped. He turned. "For this one?" The puppy sat on Grant's boot. Grant looked down. "Yes." Walter nodded. Then returned to the wood. Grant waited. "That's it?" Walter glanced over. "What did you want? A speech?" "No." "Good. I don't have one." Grant stood there another second. Walter blew sawdust from the edge. "Name?" Grant frowned. "I don't know." Walter looked past him toward Sadie's shelter. The rebuilt wall was clean cedar except for one old section. Faded red. Walter nodded toward it. "Red." Grant stared at him. "That's terrible." "It's short. It's lazy." "You found him behind a red board." "I found all three behind a red board." Walter shrugged. "The others already have names." Grant shook his head. "No." The puppy looked up at him. Walter resumed sanding. "Fine." 3 days later, Grant stood behind his house while the puppy dug enthusiastically at a patch of snow beside the porch. "Red." The puppy ignored him. Grant frowned. "Red, come." The little German shepherd lifted his head. One ear upright. The other tilted. Then he bounded toward Grant, with snow on his muzzle. Grant caught himself smiling. Only afterward did he realize what he had called him. Walter never needed to win the argument. The name had done it for him. And so Red stayed. Nearly a year passed. Not dramatically. No single morning announced that things had changed. Winter loosened into spring. Spring became a dry Idaho summer. The hills browned at the edges. Then autumn came back through the pines, and the first snow arrived one quiet November morning, as if the year had simply turned a page. Walter Finch was still 74 when the leaves began to fall, and 75 by the time the snow returned. He had not become younger. His right ankle still stiffened in cold weather. Some mornings he used the cane before breakfast and abandoned it by noon. Other mornings he pretended he did not need it at all, until Sadie looked at him with enough judgment to make Helen laugh. Sadie had filled out again. Her black and tan coat had regained its shine, and the sharp angles along her ribs were gone. But she did not move like a young dog anymore. She still followed Walter into the workshop. She still waited beside the porch when he was outside too long. She simply did it at a slower pace. Helen came by twice a week. Sometimes with soup, sometimes without. Walter repaired one of her kitchen drawers, a lamp base, and a small side chair that Helen swore was not worth fixing. Walter disagreed. Helen continued bringing medication from town whenever weather made the drive unpleasant. She no longer called it helping. Walter no longer insisted on paying for gas every single time. They had settled on a system in which he sharpened her garden tools in spring. No one had formally negotiated this. That was how Grant knew it was working. People stopped keeping score when the exchange became part of ordinary life. Grant had changed too. Less visibly. Red did not heal him. Grant would have distrusted anyone who said a dog could do that. Some losses were not wounds waiting to close. They were architecture. They changed the shape of the rooms you lived in. Elaine remained part of his house. Her old scarf still hung near the mudroom. The repaired walnut table still stood by the window. Grant still remembered the exact way she used to push her hair behind one ear when concentrating. There were mornings when he woke before dawn and reached across the bed without thinking. His hand found cold sheets. That still hurt. It simply no longer ruined the whole day. Because usually, somewhere around 6:30, Red would decide Grant had spent enough time being philosophical. The young shepherd would scratch once at the bedroom door. Then twice. Then, if Grant remained still, produce a low impatient sound that was not quite a bark. Grant would sit up. Fine. Red's tail would strike the hallway wall. That was the morning. No revelation. No cure. Just a man getting dressed because a dog needed to go outside. Sometimes life returned that way. Not as meaning, as obligation. And then, strangely, meaning followed. The first real snowfall of the new winter came on a Tuesday. Grant noticed that before he noticed anything else. Tuesday. A year earlier, Tuesdays had meant very little. Now they meant coffee at Walter's. Red knew that too. By 8:30, he was already pacing between the front door and the kitchen. Grant pulled on his boots. "You're early." Red stared. Grant put on his dark green field jacket. 20 minutes. Red continued staring. "You're becoming difficult." The dog sneezed. Grant took that as disrespect. They left on foot. The road looked familiar. Not exactly the same. That was important. The fence where Grant had first seen Sadie had been repaired during summer. Several posts had been replaced. The pasture beyond it was clean and open. The red board was gone. For a second, Grant slowed. Red moved ahead, then looked back. Grant remembered the first winter. Sadie half standing in the snow. 3 puppies breathing under wool blankets. Walter's cap in his hands. How narrow the world had felt in that moment. One red board. One dog. One unanswered question. He had thought he was walking toward a problem. He had not understood that he was walking toward people. Red trotted back and nudged his glove. Grant rubbed the dog's head. "Come on." They continued. The path toward Walter's house had changed too. Caleb had spread gravel beneath the places where ice tended to form. Someone had installed a simple handrail beside the short slope near the workshop. Walter had objected to the handrail for 3 weeks. then used it every day. No one mentioned this. Respect sometimes required strategic blindness. When Grant reached the property, he saw something new on the porch. He stopped. A wooden sign hung beside the front door. Small. Hand-cut. The shape was uneven enough that Grant knew Walter had made it, rather than buying it. What caught his attention was the paint. Faded red. Grant walked closer. Walter had used the last good section of the old board, the piece not incorporated into Sadie's shelter. The paint had been cleaned but not restored. Scratches remained. One edge showed bare wood where years of weather had stripped it away. 3 words had been carved across the center. "Come on in." Grant stared. Red had no patience for symbolism. He ran onto the porch. Sadie appeared almost immediately from beside Walter's chair. The 2 dogs touched noses. Red circled once, then dropped into an awkward play bow, despite being nearly full-grown. Sadie looked at him as if evaluating whether this much enthusiasm was really necessary. Walter sat beneath the porch roof with a wool blanket over his knees and 2 mugs of coffee on the small table beside him. He watched Grant looking at the sign. Grant finally said, "I thought you hated people walking into your house." Walter lifted 1 mug. "I'm experimenting." "With what?" "Poor decisions." Grant looked at the sign again. Walter added, "Helen says hospitality." "That sounds worse." "It probably is." Grant stepped onto the porch. The front door behind Walter stood partly open. Not wide. Just a narrow, dark line leading into the warmer room beyond. Grant noticed that too. He sat in the empty chair. Walter pushed the second mug toward him. No question. No offer. It was already his. Grant wrapped both hands around it. The coffee was too hot. Exactly right. Red moved between the porch and the yard. He returned to Sadie. Then came back to Grant. Then changed his mind and went to Walter. Grant watched him make the circuit twice. Walter said, "He still hasn't figured out where he belongs." Grant shook his head. "I think he has." Red stopped halfway between them. His ears lifted. Snow settled across his back. Grant looked at him. "Go on." Red glanced toward Grant, then toward Sadie. "Go." The dog bounded back onto the porch and lay down beside his mother. Grant followed more slowly. That was the difference. A year earlier, Grant would have thought belonging meant choosing one place, one person, one duty, one side of the door. Now he was less certain. Maybe belonging could be wider than that. Red could live with Grant and still run to Sadie. Helen could help Walter and still need Walter. Walter could remain independent and still have people close enough to notice when something was wrong. Grant could love Elaine and still build new routines that did not include her. None of those things canceled the others. That realization was not dramatic enough to feel like revelation. It felt more like adjusting the focus on something that had been there for a long time. Later that morning, Helen arrived carrying bread. She walked through the front door without knocking. Walter shouted from the porch, "You could at least pretend to read the sign." Helen answered from inside. "It says come in." "It says come on in." "What's the difference?" "Tone." Grant laughed into his coffee. Caleb arrived 20 minutes later to check the chimney cap after the first heavy snow. He did knock. Walter complained about that too. By 10, the kitchen was warm. Sadie was asleep near the stove. Red had stolen half of Walter's rug. Helen was slicing bread. and Caleb was explaining why Walter absolutely was not climbing onto the roof in December. Walter objected. Helen ignored him. Grant watched from the doorway. The scene would have irritated him once. Too many voices. Too much motion. No control over where anything was supposed to be. Now it simply looked like a house being used. His eyes moved to the red sign outside. A year ago, that wood had stood against a bank with one purpose: keep the wind out. Protect what was behind it. There had been nothing wrong with that. Walls mattered. Shelter mattered. Boundaries mattered. Grant understood those things better than most. But a house made entirely of walls was not a home. At some point, there had to be a door. And at some point, somebody had to decide it could open. Not all the way. Not for everyone. Just enough. That distinction mattered too. Walter had not become dependent. Grant had not become social. Helen had not turned into anyone's caretaker. Caleb still complained that all three of them made his volunteer job harder than necessary. Nothing had transformed cleanly. It had simply become connected. That afternoon, Grant and Red started home through light snow. Walter stood on the porch with Sadie beside him. Helen's SUV was still in the drive. Caleb's truck was gone. Grant looked back once. The red sign moved slightly in the wind. Come on in. Walter lifted his mug. Grant lifted one hand. Red ran several yards ahead, stopped, then returned as usual to make sure Grant was still there. I'm coming. Red turned again. The road stretched white between the pines. Grant remembered how much he once valued walking it alone. He still liked quiet. That had not changed. But quiet no longer meant absence. There were people behind him now. A dog ahead of him. A repaired table waiting at home. A Tuesday next week that already belonged to someone else. And that was not a loss of freedom. Grant understood that now. Sometimes independence was not the ability to need nothing. Sometimes it was the freedom to choose what and who you allowed to matter. Snow continued to fall. Soft. Steady. Red moved ahead through it. Grant followed. And behind them, Walter Finch's front door stayed unlocked. Not because winter had become less dangerous. Not because anyone had stopped aging. Not because grief had disappeared. The world had not grown gentler. They had simply stopped insisting on facing all of it alone. Sometimes strength is not proving that we can carry everything alone. Sometimes it is having the courage to leave the door open, just enough for someone else to stand beside us. Grant, Walter, Sadie, and Red never escaped loss, age, or winter. What changed was the way they carried those things. A repaired roof, a shared cup of coffee, a dog waiting by the door. Small acts can become quiet forms of grace when life feels cold. Maybe that is how hope often reaches us. Not through a great miracle, but through someone who keeps showing up. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. And tell us about someone who once stood close when you needed them. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel. May your home know warmth, your heart know peace, and may you never overlook the quiet grace already waiting at your door.